Hey, this is Remy Franklin. I'm here in Lander, Wyoming on September 18th and just wrapped up my last training session with climbing coach Steve Bechtel, who I've been working with for about 2 weeks up here. And this morning we got into program design and started to map out my training plan over the next couple months, which is pretty exciting. Before I tell you about that, the clip you saw right at the beginning of the vlog was from climbing in Fremont Canyon this weekend, which is a pretty cool place. We actually got to do some really sweet multi-pitch Steve Bechtel FAs that Steve put up back in the 90s, which was pretty fun to go discover those. I don't think they get done that often, but they're fantastic routes. So maybe a little bit more footage of that coming out soon. To jump right into what we were doing this morning, basically I was starting to take the fundamentals of training that I've been learning with Steve over the last couple of weeks and start to lay them out into a pretty comprehensive training plan for the next 6 months. And if you've been following along with this vlog, you'll know that the sort of different topics we've covered over the last couple of weeks have been training strength, training power, how to use bouldering as a training tool, non-specific endurance training, and then short strength endurance and density training. And so I think what I've sort of gotten here is some of the fundamentals of Steve Bechtel's approach to training for climbing, and just enough of an introduction so that when Steve and I talk over the next couple of weeks and really lay out the day-to-day of my training plan, I'll know, how to go do those workouts, how to go do limit bouldering, how to go do, a 5x5 strength workout. So that's really exciting. And I'll go ahead and show you a little bit about the spreadsheet work that we were doing this morning to give you a sense for how we're really approaching this process of building a training plan. All right, so this is the spreadsheet that Steve uses as a template to work with a bunch of his athletes. And we sort of started to work with this morning. It's really useful for getting a sort of big picture view of training cycles on like a several month to year-long basis. And so what you can see going on here is we are basically dealing with these 13 4-week training phases, which is kind of fun actually to realize that there are 13 4-week phases, not just 12 months. So we get a little bit more training time than it might have seemed otherwise. The number we plugged in here is 400 training hours or training and climbing hours for the year, which is a pretty rough estimate. It's hard to know since I haven't recorded my past training and climbing in a lot of detail how much I'm already doing. But we're starting with a pretty conservative number, figuring we can always ramp up. But what you see is if I were to change this number to say 300, all the numbers on the rest of the spreadsheet would go ahead and adjust. So it's well set up to be customized pretty easily. And then we're starting this on October 2nd this year. And so what you see is here we have, dates, these 4-week cycles, 1, 2 through 13, and each phase has an emphasis. So there are 5 types of phases: strength, power, endurance, performance, and recovery. And you can see that this first one, I'm going to be in Yosemite, so it's really a performance phase. And then I'll do a strength phase and a power phase, strength, power, and then look at performing again, second half of February into March. And so then for each of these performance phases, what's really useful is to say, what is my training emphasis? And so just for example, in Yosemite, I'm going to really focus on just sort of red pointing, routes that aren't too hard, have a lot of fun, learn some big wall skills, and don't hurt my finger. So that's sort of my goals I've set out for myself while I'm there. And then for each of these phases, again, we can go ahead and plug in what percent of the year hours we're expecting to take place in that phase. So again, 13 phases. Phase 1, right now we're looking at maybe 9% of these 400 year hours are going to go into that phase, and then that gets broken down week by week. So in week 1, we're looking at 23% of those week hours, 27, 23, 27, etc., for a total of 36 training climbing hours in that 4-week cycle. So what we see here is that I think is pretty interesting is that in these 4-week phases, what Steve often does is vary the amount of training you're actually doing each week. So the training volume isn't spread evenly across 4 weeks. So it seems like there's a few different options we'll use. This is basically like a 1, 3, 2, 4, where like 1 and 3 are slightly easier weeks than 2 and 4, doing a little bit more load in the second and fourth weeks to give some rest in the other weeks. And then it looks like in many weeks or many of the training phases, I'll be ramping up week by week. So I'll start the first week with a pretty light load, 15% of those training hours, and then work up to 32%. And then the other option similar to that first one is the 20-30-20-30. So I think that's important because we're building these cycles where we're trying to promote adaptation and overload, right? So it makes sense to start with a little bit easier and work up the volume and then go back to a little bit of rest and do it again. So then again, in each of these phases, even though this is a performance phase, I'm still going to be doing some finger strength work, some general strength work, power, short endurance, long endurance, and mobility. But you do see that for almost every phase, the majority of the time is focused on practice or climbing. So we are building in the climbing hours into this training program. And even other sort of work that I'm doing, whether that's sort of general cardiovascular work or yoga, I'm going to try to make sure I'm tracking that in here as well, so that we're really taking account of all the variables. But again, even while each phase has an emphasis, performance, strength, power, etc., you'll see that again in each phase we're training all of these things, just varying the emphasis. And so based on what the phase is and what week it is and the percentage of the training hours that are going into that week, the spreadsheet goes ahead and populates what that week is going to look like in terms of the hours of training and climbing spent on each of these emphases. So I'm going to do in that first week, if we kept the numbers the way they are, I would do just 20 minutes of finger strength work over the week. Up to 23 the next week, down to 20, down to 23. And then in the strength phase, I'd be ramping that up. And so this gets into a lot of detail. I'm sure I'll change the numbers. But I think what's really useful about it is that it starts with a really big picture, sort of how many training hours are we doing in the year, like what kind of volume and intensity can I handle, which, I'm sure I'll adjust over the months. And then keeps the emphasis on these training goals or the training emphasis for that cycle, so that all of the workouts I build in more detail on a week-to-week and day-to-day basis lead to this outcome. So for me, my next big climbing goal is to red point this climb called Doubt. It's super crimpy, pretty long, has a powerful boulder crux. So I'm going to be in these strength and power phases focusing on training with that goal in mind. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense for the process we're going through to build a training plan based around my specific climbing goals and where I'm at. I think the level of detail we're getting into can be a little bit daunting at first, but the key I think is just to start big and then make sure that every lift, every workout I'm doing is leading towards these larger cycles and goals that I've set out for myself. So that's wrapping up my video blog series on training with Steve for the first time here. I'm sure I'll be reporting back more on the training process as other vlogs come out and hopefully getting some new content going. And I'll be sad to leave Lander, Wyoming. I'm headed back down to Tucson for a week and then out to Yosemite for October, which I'm really excited for. But I'm going to have to build in some climbing goals that are based here in Lander, so I have an excuse to get back next summer, hopefully. Thanks again for checking in, and we'll see you soon.